Tell me about the hidden worlds, the exploration of hidden worlds. What does that mean?
Well, so not only is that sort of it's kind of a double entendre of sorts. It's both meant to be the hidden worlds within the video games that I create. For any of you who have read the book or seen the movie Ready Player One, written by Ernest Cline here in town. Chris is apparently a fan.
He's in town?
Yeah, he lives
Oh
here
my
in town.
God, I love that book.
But in any case, if you haven't read the book or seen the movie, Ready Player One is a story about a creator of virtual worlds who, in a Willy Wonka sense, leaves as he's old and about to pass on, leaves his fortune to the gamer who solves the riddle of his games. But in any case, Ernest has known of me, although we didn't really know each other personally, through his time here in Austin, and I'm the inspiration for the main character called Halliday, who's the creator of that virtual world in Ready Player One. And so that's part of what that's meant to imply, is these kind of secrets buried within my own games. But similarly, it goes back to the other part of the book, the explore part. I, at least, am a believer that what inspires me in my creative work is my passion for exploration and going out and seeking those hidden thoughts. And in fact, how I relate, what this book is an attempt to do is kind of show at least how that works for me, and therefore I think it might work for others. And you'll see that also in the presentation I'm going to give, kind of how I structure my approach to plot lines and craft. And you'll see hopefully how it's kind of inspired by research and exploration.
I think that we're close enough to time. I was at Book People when this was launched, and Richard did his talk about it, and that's when I got my very own autographed copy. So you can't have it, although you can look at it before you leave.
That's my copy.
But one of the things that intrigued me about Richard's book was the fact that he's got a co-author right there on the front, on the dust jacket. And it's like, we've had Jessica Hageman, who's a ghostwriter, tell us about how she ghostwrites for people. And so you think it's by one person, but it's really by Jess. And you know, we've had a lot of guests that have talked about how they find editors and people that help them with their work and whatever. But here's one of the, here's like the commercial, the most interesting man in the world, and out of it, because he doesn't limit himself to the world. Here's one of the most interesting people on the planet, and yet he thinks he has to have somebody else's name on the book cover. And so that's one of the reasons I wanted him to talk to us. Richard, it's all yours.
Great, thank you. If you have a question first, please feel free.
Why the writer? Why did you partner with someone?
Well, I think my presentation will make that clear.
Okay, good.
But let me, but answer in advance so you can sort of look at it, look for it, which is that I actually think that for writing interactive prose in a computer gaming sense, I actually think I would argue that I'm one of the world-leading experts, period. You know, I mean, because I've been doing it longer than anyone else, and you know, there are others who are also very good at it, but it's a very rare skill set. And I would actually say that skill set is not generally held by people who do traditional writing of novels or screenplays. It's because it's that unique. And I also think that I'm at least a very comfortable orator, like right now. But I find that if I give a talk, which I'm very happy with how it went presentationally, but I then look at a transcript
Yes.
of my live words, they are a terrible read. And so you combine those things together, and so I knew that though I knew what I wanted in the content of this book, I knew what the individual chapters would be, what the vignettes that I wanted to describe. But I also knew that one, if I just described them and transcribed them, they would be terrible. And I also knew I would not do nearly as good a job at arranging them in a linear prose because I don't do linear prose. And so that's fundamentally why I got David Fisher. So we did a lot of transcriptions, and then he did a lot of reworking of my vignettes. And then fundamentally, the structure of the book is completely him, with some negotiation, of course. But, but he's the initial proposer of that. But so that's a good setup. So let me kind of take you through this. So first of all, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the fundamental learning that I think has come out of my 40 plus years now in video games. I think is still helpful to the writing of linear prose, and it has a lot to do with like I've heard from you all saying you've had life experiences or personal areas that you were the domain experts on, and so therefore you wrote a book in that domain, and that makes perfect sense. I actually had a little bit of a different journey in gaming that you'll see that comes up, and that I wasn't a domain expert on anything yet. And yet I decided, therefore, I wanted to talk about a certain domain, so I had to go learn it. And that research process is, I think, really important, even if you think you're the domain expert on a subject. And that sort of comes out here with what I'm going to talk about. So first, some of you heard, I have this weird dual career in both video games as well as commercial human spaceflight. My father was an NASA astronaut, my mother was an artist. I actually think computer games are the quintessential high-tech art, so it's no surprise that having a high-tech dad and an artistic mother, that's where I found myself. But then as I built this 4-year career in gaming, I really still wanted to go to space. And so as I earned money in one field, I invested in the other, and then ultimately did succeed in taking myself to space by virtue of building a variety of entrepreneurial companies to slowly take stepping stones from living on the Earth to exploring the extremes of the poles and the deep sea, to zero-G parabolas, and eventually I'm on the co-founder of something called the X Prize. We paid a $10 million prize for the first private vehicle to fly into space. And then a company called Space Adventures, which has flown all 7 private citizens to fly into space, including myself. But I'm really here to talk about story stuff. At the end, if you want to talk about space, I'm happy to talk about space forever. But I really want to talk about intellectual property. And what's interesting about the lessons of that, and I've tried to modify it to even break it out of just games and also talk about what would be the same truths I think might be true for writers, is that when you think of computer games, everybody goes like, well, that's Tetris. It's a lot of fun to play. It's got a good gameplay mechanic, but people can copy gameplay mechanics, right? So that's not unique. And if you're writing, you can imagine, as opposed to a mechanic that might be how it rhymes or what the meter is or these sort of things. And those aren't protectable, right? That might be unique to you as a writer, but it's not completely unique to you as a writer. You're often borrowing from history, and even if you come up with something that's cool and clever, other people will do something similar if they want to. And the same thing is true in our case of, in computer games, there's always the latest and greatest bells and whistles, bigger explosions, better sound effects, virtual reality, whatever it might be. But those, again, are just transient bells and whistles that it's a constant arms race to advance in. And printing's actually been pretty darn stable for pretty much forever. But you could at least imagine that people have done some pretty clever printing ideas with books about how things wrap or that may or may not have any value to the text. But even if it did, again, that's hard to protect. But the one thing that is truly unique about what you're putting into your book is the intellectual property. What is my angle? What have I researched? What am I expressing that is fundamentally better or fundamentally more unique than anybody else could write today? And so that is a truism about what I do and you do. And it reminds me of something that there's another writer here in town, a guy named Bruce Sterling. Do you know Bruce Sterling? Bruce.
No Crash?
Yes, exactly. Bruce
He's in
Sterling
town
is
too?
kind of a cyberpunk author here in town, and he came to speak at a game developers conference about 20 years ago. And when he got up on stage, he said, I'm not exactly sure why I was asked to write at a gaming conference, because I don't write games. I have no idea. He said, but I did notice something interesting, which is that as a writer, I'm trying to write the very best book ever written. And the odds of me doing that are close to 0. But if I do that, it will probably last in the top 10 of books for a long time, because the top 10 of books is pretty stable, because the technology is not changing much, and The reason why it was hard to get there, there's been a lot of really good writers over a long period of time doing it. He said, you guys in the gaming industry have the opposite problem. He said, the odds of writing the very best game ever written is actually pretty easy. They've only existed for 20 years. 20 years ago, people didn't really know what the art form was like, so they're still trying to figure it out. And the technology to write games on now is way better than the technology 20 years ago. And so the odds of writing the best game ever written is great, is very, very high. But the odds of that standing the test of time is actually really low, because people are learning how to write interactive prose better, the technology is getting better, and he said, and the worst yet is, the technology you wrote your early games on is already disappearing. And so you won't even be able to see the games you wrote. So you might have written the very best game in the history of the world, and 10 years from now, no one will ever even have the opportunity to see it.
That's a bummer.
Hello, by the way, Richard. And you are?
Chuck Clayton, sorry.
Chuck? Oh, no, please, thanks, Chuck. Watch out for the sun. If you sit there, you'll love that.
Yeah, Chuck.
But in any case, so my reaction to Bruce's comments was actually, I was actually really sad, because I was sitting there going like, wow, I've been in since literally the beginning, and already the early computers to see my own work literally don't exist. And so even I will never see them. And I'll show you how I reacted to that in kind of my interesting journey on the gaming side. And so I've been making games really forever. I go back to the time when, before personal computers, when things like a PDP-1 had something called core memory, where it literally was individual little Ferris rings to store a single bit. And so each one of those pieces of hardware is a bit, and they were sewn together by a seamstress to really do this work. And the input to this device was a paper tape strip, and the output of this device was an electromechanical typewriter that would draw things out. But it would still draw. I was really interested. I just read Lord of the Rings, and I was really inspired by J.R.R. Tolkien. We'll come back to that in a minute. And the game Dungeons and Dragons was published, so I was an early adopter of D&D. And my games were an emulation of these medieval fantasy worlds, in the sense of those asterisks or walls, spaces for corridors, dollar sign was treasure, and every time you'd move, you'd have to wait about 30 seconds for it to print out another little map, so it was very slow frame rate. But that started a series of games that I'm still best known for, ran on for 20 years. It's called the Ultima series. And it started in 1980 and went all the way through about 2000. And the last one of those actually still runs to this day. But when personal computers came out, I then sat down with my mom, who's an artist, and she showed me how to draw in perspective. And then I used my high school geometry to figure out how to do sines and cosines and tangents to try to figure that out. I had my dad do the calculus to confirm my math. And I made the first ever three-dimensional games. But these games are still just run around, collect treasure, fight monsters, nothing much to them. This one is how to make a little monster shape that showed up in the game. I began to get things published. I'm just telling you how hard this is. I'm going to go through these quickly because it just shows, the old stories of I had to walk back and forth to school both ways in the snow uphill. There were no art tools in this age. For me to do art on the computer, I had to first draw it on graph paper, convert that into binary, convert that into hexadecimal, poke that into memory, write code to copy that into the area that hopefully was on screen. And if it didn't look right, I'd have to debate which step did I screw up. So that was really what it took to make art back in these early days.
Sounds like fun.
It was fun, actually, for me. And so the games over time slowly got more and more sophisticated. But an interesting thing happened with this one, Ultima 3. The first publishers I worked with were California companies that tended to be, I'll say, fly-by-night organizations run by drug addicts, to be frank. And so they went out of business owing me a bunch of money.
Oh, no.
And so with Ultima 3, obviously the third in this series that was doing quite well, my brother came to me and said, hey, why don't we go into business together? I at least know to pay you, And I'm going, that's the best deal I've ever had. So let's do it. But that also meant that I got fan mail for the first time in my life. And what's interesting about this game and all the ones before it were really just simple run around, fight monsters, collect treasure, and that is really it. But what I got back as fan mail was people reading into my games a lot of story meaning that was never there. And they also told me what they did as behavior that even though I thought I was writing a game about you're supposed to be the hero, they were doing things like running around and murdering all the villagers in town just because they thought it was fun. And they got a little bit of gold out of it. And so actually, as your way to min-max your experience as a player, that was actually a little faster than not killing the villagers, right? And there was no consequence of killing the villagers, and so everybody did it. And I sat down and said, okay, I need to change fundamentally the way I'm writing these games. And so I created this game, and when I was working on this, I suddenly realized I want to create an experience where it matters how you go on this journey, not just the end goal. But I also knew that if I forced you to behave well, if all I did was stop you from killing the villagers, that's not nearly as salient a lesson as not only let you kill the villagers, but actually tempt you to kill the villagers, but then show you why that is a really bad idea in the long run. And bad idea not only because the police will come bonk you on the head and throw you in prison, but because the villagers will all learn to hate you, and then if they're not going to help you in your longer quest. And so I began to go like, if I'm going to tell like ethical parables, that means I need a system of ethics that I can not only make into a game, but that I actually believe, in an important sense of the word believe, that I thought was worthy of championing in some way. So I said, okay, well, where do you start? Well, you go, okay, well, there's the 10 Commandments. I didn't really want to do a game about the 10 Commandments. I could use the alternate side, the 7 deadly sins you see in scary movies, and going, that's not really what I want to do. So I went, wow, I've got to go study philosophy. And so I bought an entire library of philosophy books and just started pouring through philosophy books. And everything from historic utopian ideals of what the society or philosophy ought to be like, and none of those seemed quite the thing I ought to build on. And after doing a whole bunch of reading, I realized I didn't like any of it. There was actually nothing that previously existed that I thought would be appropriate for me to champion in my games. And so I sat down and said, okay, I'm going to do the hard work of figuring out a philosophy. And so what I did is I went through all these books that I already made tons of marks and put tabs in. I said, I'm going to pull all good ideals out and put them on a Post-it note, and they're going to go above the horizontal line of goodness and badness. Put a Post-it note. Truth is a good idea. Compassion is a good idea. Hatred, bad idea. And as I then began to put all these things up and above and below, I began to see patterns. Like, obviously love and compassion are related to each other. And then you go, okay, well, justice is a little complex. It's a kind of a compound thought. You go, it's important. What is truth? And the truth of the situation is clearly important in justice, but also so is compassion. Because, if a kid is stealing bread to eat, you don't want to cut their hand off. You want to help them out of their actual problem. So I began to go, I can see relationships between these ideals of goodness, things that motivate people to good deeds and things that motivate people to bad deeds. And I eventually noticed that I could, with a simple set of just 3, truth and love and courage, I at least could rationalize almost everything else I could see on the board as either the presence of one or multiples of these, or the presence of one and the absence of another. I could sort of, it wasn't perfect, but it was foundational enough. And since I'm really writing a game, I'm not really writing a book on moral philosophy. I'm really creating a game experience, but a game experience with social relevance. And so I then started crafting not only the story, but this game experience where, for example, there's hello, hi, Richard Gary.
I met you in your home.
Oh, excellent, good to see you. And so when I started writing this, so one example was there's a blind herb seller who, when you buy things from her, she says, the total will be 20 gold pieces. Please just leave it in the coffer near the exit. And as long as you drop a few gold coins in her coffer, she will allow you to say thank you very much and let you exit. But people quickly realized that if she asked for 20 and you leave 3, she would still say thank you very much and let you exit. And so almost every player drops 3 and exits. But of course, it's a computer game. The computer knows you're doing this, right? So the computers keep track of who's lying, cheating, person. And so the game has this entire set of hidden karma values, you might describe them as. And as you get later and later into the game, you might find out that woman actually is the keeper of some great secret you really need. You go back to ask her for this great secret. She said, look, I'd love to help the hero, but you're the most dishonest, thieving scumbag I've ever met, so no way I'm helping you. and thus became the entire product. And what was interesting about this is it was also important for me that the character you played was not your alter ego. In other words, in most games, you create a character, but that character isn't me. It could be the evil wizard that I want to play this afternoon, right? It's not you. And so if it's an alter ego, then you might think it's okay to go kill all the villagers, right? Because that's how you're having fun today. In my case, it was really important that you feel bad personally if you do bad behaviors in this experience. And so that's where I found this Sanskrit word avatar and said, and the way this game works is that actually you go through a character creation process that is actually a psychological profile of you. That determines your character's attributes. The story introduction is how you from Earth find your way through a magical portal into my fictional world. And even though in my world you might show up as a buff warrior with a sword, and in reality you're a little skinny little computer nerd, it explains that also. But the point is, it's you. This is your avatar in my world. And that's, by the way, this is where the word avatar comes from in its modern use, is this game. Okay, so the games go on and on. They get bigger and more, as the power of machines go up, the graphics get better over time. I began to play with even more purposefully disquieting concepts. And so this was a very controversial one that I did because it has this pentagram on the front of it. And I knew that it was going to be controversial at the time that I did it. And in fact, it got me banned from a wide variety of stores. But for those of you who know the history of this, while in modern, this shows up in scary movies all the time, but for some reason, showing up in a scary game is not okay. So that part I found a little disingenuous. But also, what I talk about in this actual game is actually the historical use of this actual shape. This actual shape goes back to the 5 proportions that are found, 5 meaning there's a geometric number that is found throughout nature, that is actually seen, even there are a lot of churches that actually have pentagrams inscribed on them. It was actually the symbol of the Knights Templar. It only became an evil symbol during post-Crusades era when different groups were becoming wealthy and were trying to steal power from each other, and then suddenly this became a more evil symbol. But I purposely bring things like this in to purposely push people out of their comfort zone, because in my mind, good art, in my mind, I'm not going to judge whether this is a particularly good piece of art or not, but in my mind, the best art is art that sort of challenges you on some level, that either talks to me about my own journey or challenges my assumptions about what what life is like in and around me. But I could go on a lot of those other plots later. But there are some interesting lessons that I think I've kind of drawn out of writing games that I think could be useful to you guys as writers too. And so one of them is imagery. The stylization. This is whether it's in prose or whether it's an illustration or in the computer game, what the objects look like in animation. And it came out of not only my own games, but other games my company published. If you look at that little list of spaceships that you see drawn up there, everybody knows what a 1950s rocket looks like, or now a SpaceX rocket.
Right.
Everybody knows what a UFO looks like, and you can draw it in your mind. The point is, you can draw it in your mind, and you can, even as not an artist, I literally, there's a word tool, dragging little ovals with a word tool, you can draw one that looks pretty good. And the same thing, everybody knows what a TIE fighter looks like, a ball with blades on the side. Everybody knows what a Death Star looks like, or it could be a Pokeball, now. And that last one sort of looks like a little Millennium Falcon. That's actually getting a little more complicated. But one of the things that George Lucas did extraordinarily well is, you think of the Star Destroyers. Look, it's a piece of pie. It's literally just a wedge. But I can't tell you how many people making games or things for your mind to talk about. If it was spaceships, like there's the one on the bottom right to you is a spaceship called a Drouthy out of one of our early space games. And it's the only one of the ships in my own company's space games I can draw for you, because it's literally a circle with a notch cut in it. All the rest became sort of gloms of, it started with a fighter plane, but then had lots of little engines that rotate on it, or turrets that rotate on it. It just sort of became this big blob of guns and engines. But it's not iconic enough for me to keep in my head, much less be able to redraw. And so I think one of the things that's really important when you're thinking of imagery is make sure that you can imagine it in your head, and preferably even a non-artist be able to sketch it. Because if you make things more complex than that, then it's not memorable, and so it doesn't stick with you over time. Another one that I learned is, remember I mentioned this truth, love, and courage. And by no means do I think truth, love, and courage are like the true virtues of humanity. But by simplifying, I don't know how much some of you have probably read at least a few Buddhist texts, but one of the things I really enjoyed reading a lot of the Buddhist texts that I've read. And in fact, I concur with a lot of with their fundamental logic. However, it also gets more, and the further you get into it, the more complex it gets. It goes from being pretty simple, starting with the purpose of the life is happiness, and the path to happiness is compassion. I get that, I like it, I endorse it. But then you go, okay, well there's this fourfold path, and then after the fourfold path, there's all these other kind of things you can do underneath that, and parts of it are more complicated, and parts of it are simpler, and I'm going like, okay, you've lost me. Not that you've lost me if it's true or not, but I mean, it's hard to keep in your head. And especially for a game, but I also just think in writing, keeping things to fairly simple rhythms has to use a Stephen Colbert word, a truthiness to it. And without regard to if it's really true, it feels, the fact that you can get your head around it, you can see a pattern in it, helps people, it feels more right, and you can sort of work out all the other parts and pieces that you've forgotten or might be misremembering. And I'll give you some examples of that here in a second. And in my case, since I was using truth, love, and courage, I could have, it made really easy patterns for me to put in characters and places. It kind of kept these rhythms of these principles going forward. Now let me talk about languages and backstory and other things. So, the first fantasy I ever read, I jumped in the deep end quickly, was Lord of the Rings from Tolkien. And I found all other fantasy wanting after that. That was a great early introduction. But it's interesting to see sort of, the places that, what I found originally inspiration and then what things I feel have sort of moved beyond. And one of those I found really inspiring was, if you read The Hobbit, one of the very first pages is a map of the Lonely Mountain where they go find the magic ring. And the writing around that map that looks like this writing that's on top of here, at first to you just looks like hen scratch, but within a few pages you realize that actually really says something. And not only does it really say something, but it's actually quite easy to read. And the reason why it's quite easy to read is it's letter for letter substitution English, and not only is it just letter for letter substitution, but it's actually runes, this Druidic runic, which was the basis of Latin letters, and so a lot of letters look exactly like they look today, like the letter B is the same except the angle is curved, and so once you get it, you go like, oh, I can read it, the map it's actually cool. It has a great truthiness to it, because the map is really readable, and it makes it immediately feel far more immersive and far more have a substantial level of depth. For me, however, it represented an interesting plus and then almost an immediate minus. My games actually began to sell globally, and my games had these cloth maps in it. The bottom picture is actually from a map of Britannia, the land that my characters were going in. And on the left-hand side it says Buccaneer's Den, and the right-hand lower one says Magencia. Those are two of the towns on this, or islands on this map. And the problem was, imagine you were somebody in Japan who picks up that map. Well, now you had to do letter for letter substitution to read Buccaneer's Den. You had to do letter for letter substitution of that font to even read that in English it says Buccaneer's Den. But then you have to translate from English into Japanese to know what the heck is a buccaneer and what the heck is a den. You know what I mean? And so if you spoke Japanese, this was profoundly hard to be able to read. And so then I said, okay, and I'm going to skip to a different slide here. Then I sat down and I said, okay, in one of my subsequent games, I said, I need to create a new language. I liked languages as part of the depth of these worlds that I created. But I want to acknowledge the fact that I'm selling to players all over the world, and so I can't make a new language for every part of the world. So how can I create a language that is equally hard and hopefully easy but at least it's equally challenging for anyone, no matter what language they spoke. And part of the story of this particular game was how aliens had visited the Earth, and they had left behind like a 2001 monolith, but they'd actually left behind writing. And so if you were imagining yourself to be an alien who comes to Earth before humanity has really evolved, and you want to leave behind a text that hopefully someday people will be able to read, well, then it wouldn't be a spoken language like English, because English didn't exist. It might be more pictographic, it might be more symbolic, that would therefore be something easier to decipher. And so I said, okay, I just want to see if I can do that. Can I make a language that is easy to read without regard to what language you speak on Earth? And I said, I didn't know if it was solvable, but let's start in. And I did it with research. So you start reading. So you pick up books on Egyptian hieroglyphics, which I knew nothing about previously. But it turns out Egyptian hieroglyphics are a terrible place to start. Because, hieroglyphics, if you know anything about them, they're not pictograms, they're phonograms, if that's the right word. So if you see a picture of a raven, it would be the sound of the Egyptian word raven as a syllable, which is why nobody could decipher it for so long, is because nobody spoke Egyptian or ancient Egyptian anymore. And then I said, okay, well, let's go some more pictographic. So ancient Chinese is actually pictographic. However, even looking at the ancient ones that were supposedly truly pictographic, I at least couldn't decipher them. And then the modern ones that got simplified are worse to try to read. So I was going like, okay, that's not going to be easy. And then I went to like hobo thought signs, and then there's modern people trying to make communication with signs like at the Olympics. People are trying to make signs that are internationally easy to read, but they tend to be like the bathroom's that way and that sport's that way. They didn't really help much. But then I actually found this reference called Bliss Symbolics. And Bliss Symbolics was actually a language that someone had been working on to communicate with the mentally handicapped. And so they were trying to solve sort of the same problem. And what's interesting about Bliss Symbolics is that it was truly pictographic. But I actually think, even for their purpose of communicating with the handicapped, had made some important errors, which is they had like special add-ons for tense and plurality and cases and other things that made it actually really hard. So you went just to the simple, they were often quite good, but as they had tried to implement it as a language, I actually think it failed to be the language it should have been. I think I could have helped them make that language better for their own purposes. But at least it was a starting place. And so I sat down with again, my piles of Post-it notes and began to say, okay, well, I sort of need my aliens to be anthropomorphic because the concept of a person I needed to be able to express that. So I actually made a change in the game design to presume that intelligent life in the universe was anthropomorphic, which I obviously don't think is true, but it was important for the game. And then I came up with other concepts, like a little box would be a thing. I came up with the concept of time, saying, a sand clock or water clock, an hourglass would be reasonable to assume would evolve on other planets, so they would presume that we in our cave of stick men might evolve through that too, so it's a good concept for time. And then person, man, woman, two people together, people, that sort of thing. So these basics. And even as I was working on these basics, I would often throw some away and bring some in. The reason to do it on Post-it notes is because I could edit sets. And so the most complicated symbol of my entire language that I worked on was this one associated with distance, going back to my mother's drawing of perspective going to a horizon. But by having that perspective going to a horizon, I could put a dot nearby to be here, a dot far away to be there, an object nearby would be this, an object far away would be that, objects nearby would be these, objects far away would be those. And so I began to just play, again, Post-it notes on a wall, just to create this whole thing out. And then I realized, okay, it worked. And that eventually became the full language. And so I'm not going to look on the right-hand side, but I'm going to read down the left-hand column, and it says, long ago, our civilization grew upon a planet which was a far journey into the stars. Long ago, our sun destroyed our home, destroyed our planet and our home. You get the idea. But the point is, it's actually pretty easy to read. Once you understand the basic symbols at all, once you've read 2 or 3 lines of this, I promise you, anyone on Earth speaking any language can read this. Wow. And so, but this is sort of that kind of the process I'm talking about, which is, want to tackle a new subject matter, go buy a library of books on the subject, dig in, and it's by creating something original like this that I think that it's why my games have had lasting power, is because, I'm not just making a simple game to go fight monsters and collect treasure. There's plenty of other people doing that. It's that, that I take the time and care to craft this sort of depth. And so these symbols sort of became written on all the architecture of all the planets you might visit in this game. There were all these things left behind by these ancient folks who had left stuff behind for people to eventually learn from. And I'm still doing that. So my most recent game is called Shroud of the Avatar. We'll see right back to it. That's my most recent game. My own character, Boy British, is still in there. It still talks about the virtues, truth, love, and courage are still the thing the games talk about. Another thing my games are big on is the realism up behind it. There's day and night cycles. All the characters in my games go to sleep at night. They all wake up in the morning. They go do their own jobs. Bad guys sneak around at night and rob people's houses. You have to go out at night to catch them. There's ancient people used to believe that a comet coming through the sky might portend some good or bad omen. In my games, it really does. We actually make it to where if you bother to learn the astronomy in my games, which almost no player is nerdy enough to do, but those that do find out that the movements of the bad guys in my games are literally lockstep to the astronomy. And so they become the sages, like the sages of old. They become the most valuable players in the game are those that have bothered to learn the arcane underpinnings of the mechanics of the universe.
So that's why my son spends so much time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
A lot to learn. Oh, and by the way, my most recent game, which only came out just about a year ago, you remember that paper tape game that I showed you at the very beginning? It was running on the core memory. So I have a printout. There's no computer anymore that exists that can run that. But I have a printout of that code. And so I actually released that code to the players of my game and asked them to rewrite it that would run in a modern machine. And so we actually embedded it in this game. And so in the game I just released is what looks like an electromechanical typewriter. And if you walk up to it and run it, it actually runs the the translated code of the thing that I wrote 40 years ago to kind of bring the whole thing full loop. Okay, which I think is kind of fun.
That is awesome.
Okay, and so so when I'm going to talk a little bit more, I'm going to go back in just a moment to kind of the differences with the problems of games and the problems of what you guys are facing with books. But at least in the subject of games, but I think this still applies to books, even if you're the domain expert, doing enough research to where you are not just offering up, people something that you get elsewhere. There's plenty of people creating plenty of content on most every subject that exists. Unless you do the work to really push your content well beyond anything anybody has done before, then you're not being, in my mind, it's very unlikely you're being original. And therefore, whatever you're writing either won't reach the level of sales that it might, but also might not have the lasting staying power that it might, as if you had really done what's obviously unique research compared to what others will have had the opportunity to do. Yeah?
Can you dig in that a little bit further, because I just went through a project like this and I discovered the same thing.
Well, so, and you were talking about the book you were just working on now is because you cared for some parents. Was that right?
Oh, that was me.
That was you. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
But as I heard other people like cookbook on jarring and other things, I mean it's clearly you're a domain expert on that, and so it could be that the amount of research you needed to do was minimal because you may not have many competitors on that front. But to the degree, I mean, I'm sure there are other books about canning and jarring, right? So those exist, and so I by no means am trying to challenge whether you did or not do that stuff, but I am guessing that part of what you chose to do or might have done or could do if you were me deciding to write something on jarring is go look at all the other books about jarring and canning.
Exactly.
And not only just that, to make sure you're not just going over trodden ground, but I at least have also found that the things that have been the biggest breakthroughs are when I'm not just looking at my competition, when I'm looking at other fields. And they can be very far away. Like if you're going to do a thing about jarring and canning, you might go, you know what, I really like the way Nickelodeon presents content to people because it's colorful, it's digestible, small pieces. And so I'm going to take an inspiration from something that has nothing to do with cookbooks, and definitely nothing to do with the jarring and canning cookbooks that I have. It has to do with kids programming. But I'm going to apply it to a book about jarring and canning because that's going to give me my really unique angle that no one has, at least to date, kind of use that to provide power to your book. And so that might be something that might be the kind of things you already did. I don't know.
It's very based on pulling historical pictures that people would not have seen. And oh my goodness, the idea was, my grandmother did that, and it's set in that kind of book.
Yes, and so you probably did quite a bit. I'm guessing you probably did a lot of digging
Yes.
to find these archives. And in my mind, that's the sort of thing that gives your book uniqueness and power, and a feeling of historical warmth that takes it outside the realm of a how-to
Yes.
text.
And ended up with partnerships at the USDA.
Right. To where you got some of that data.
Well, not just the data, but how creative ways to present it too.
Oh, excellent. Excellent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When you do that, do you sit down and say, okay, this is what the outcome is that I want to create, this is the feel, this is what I want to do, and then you find it, or you just go, like research, and then whenever you get inspired, grab another book?
It's a mix. It's a little bit of both. And so, for example, can you have the black pen that's on the other side of you right there?
This one.
Yeah, right there. Perfect. And so I usually have two things, at least for me. I usually have two pieces. Like, one, what do I really want to say with this next narrative? And that is almost always tied to relatively recent political events or global events. It's almost always seeing, why is it we're still fighting wars about territory that have been going on for 1,000 years or whatever. Pick your global issue that is happening in the world. But what I do is I recast it in a way that I don't think, I don't write a book about war or peace or a game. I actually tell a story that I believe that when people experience the story, they will then go, oh, I see, war's a bad thing. It's somewhat tangential. And in fact, I'm gonna tell you, I want to have the cover to one of my favorites. Let's see if I've got the cover here. This is my actual favorite cover of any of my games. And it's because of the trap that I set for players from the beginning. This game, Ultima 6, is called The False Prophet. And you can see the Ankh tabard is the robes that the avatar of your character, this paragon of virtue, wears in all the games. So this is you, standing heroically, bathed in light, with your foot planted very much like St. George and the Dragon in the chest of this wreathing gargoyle with red leathery skin, sunken eyes, horns, fangs, claws, obviously bad evil, right? And the game opens, the opener of the game is that you have been captured by these beasts and are about to be ritualistically killed. When your friends from the previous games, in this sort of animated initial sequence, barely rescue you in time, killing the people here who were about to kill you. But then as you flee, and the game begins now to operate versus be in this opening cinematic, these creatures, these gargoyles, are invading the surface world. And they're pouring up out of all these dungeon entrances that go down into the places where you fought things in the previous games. And that's how the game begins. And so you start by defending yourself, right? There's these bad guys all coming up to the surface and massacring people in the villages, and they're really after you too, by the way. They're absolutely targeting you individually, but they're also just massacring anybody and everybody you know. And so you are here fighting them back, and you can fight them back basically forever to a stalemate because they just keep coming up out of the ground. And so eventually you go, okay, well, we better go down there and kill the queen or whatever it takes to stop the hatching of these bad guys that are coming up. And you fight your way down into the underworld. And when you get down there, you find that it's not just like the movie Aliens with a hatchery of these bad guys. There's actually cities built by these creatures. And these creatures have, culture, families, writing, and you can either massacre them all and lose, or you can bother to read what it is they've got in their books and learn how to communicate with them. And if you do, you find out that they believe you are the false prophet, that the things you've done in the past have actually worked against their society. And they are here to kill you off because their prophecy describes how you will come in here and eradicate their species. And what are you doing right now? Coming in here and eradicating their species. And so I've set you up from the beginning in a way to sort of show that we're all able to make assumptions based on tropes that we were raised with, to see that things with horns and claws and stuff are evil, when in fact that's just how we were raised. And so, you know, that's how you can see how these things, whether it's racism or sexism or other things that we still struggle with in society, and it's because we pass it on from generation to generation as a trope. And unless you actively fight against those tropes, you shouldn't be surprised if they continue. You get the idea?
Yeah, cool.
And so that's one of my favorite stories. And so that was very purposeful. That was very much of, this is the subject I wanted to tackle with this one. But you can see as a player, you wouldn't really see it as a play against current events, right? I mean, it's woven in a way that is sort of different. But then to talk about other things, like I always have these languages and stuff, those are usually little special projects I have on the side that have nothing to do with the message. They just have to do with the me fancying myself a Tolkien-style, game designer. But here's a project that I've been working on for 30 years and it's still not solved. So this one's unsolved. Let's see. Let's see if I can do. Whoops, sorry. Let's see. Dot. Voiced and voiced. So the language I put up that was pictographic is great for imparting an idea, but not how to say something, right? It's not a spoken language. And so I've always wanted also to come up with a universal script. Actually, the first time we did this was in the same game, that is independent of language. So I could express visually how to pronounce things. And it's interesting, if you think about the letters B, P, F, and V, they all have the exact same mouth position. One is voiced and unvoiced, and some are plosive or long. And so the is voiced and let me see the best way to do this is going to do this and less dots on dots. Okay. If it has a dot on it, it's plosive. If it has a tilde on it, it's voiced. If it has a dash, it is unvoiced. So the is voiced and plosive. Is plosive but unvoiced. Is not plosive, sorry. Oh, hang on. There we go. And is not plosive and voiced. Okay, so those are all the same. And it turns out you can pick, there's only about 5 mouth positions, and you can make a mapping right here of every sound you can make in the English language, and any language, any human mouth-created language. What I haven't been able to figure out is, what is so I know I want to add this little tilde if it's voiced, and this little dot if it's plosive, but I don't know what the base thing is. Like, do you want to make it's like your lips touching each other, but then you kind of run out of ways to articulate the base letter. I've never found a good base letter to use to fill out this little mapping of how to voice letters. But anyway, these are the sort of weird little side projects I take on that, one day I'll solve it, or maybe I won't, but I have like a dozen of these just always being worked on simultaneously also. Okay. Okay, so now I want to take you over to why Kent actually invited me here in the first place. Which is, it's interesting that I have another book out that I tried to grab a copy before I came out this morning. I'm afraid I didn't have one in my little cabin. Which is, I partnered with a writer by the name of Tracy Hickman. He wrote a series of books called Dragonlance. It's a very popular fantasy series. And I partnered with him both on helping me create the plot for that most recent game that I came up with, but we also wrote a book that included the backstory of that game. And what's interesting about that is to see how that partnership in writing happened. And because we had utterly different skill sets we brought to both problems. And in the case of the game, by all means, I was the dominant voice. In the case of the book, you'll see why he was the dominant voice. But as an example, this book that we wrote together called Sword of Midras is sort of the background story to the current game, and it's about how this warrior finds this magic sword, and what this magic sword does for him is doesn't make him powerful. What it makes him do is have empathy in the subjects of truth, love, and courage. And basically, he's actually a captain of the bad guy's army, and it ultimately turns him into someone who cares. And as we were going through that book, you know, Tracy, when we were trying to outline this thing together, he would come up with these vignettes that were incredibly heroic, but had nothing to do with learning about truth. You know what I mean? Or, you know, he'd go into a city where he decides not to massacre everybody, but his turn as to how to show you that you had this epiphany about love, you know, was wanting, to say the least. And so I was always having to push him to go, you know, that's a great scene, but it has nothing to do with what we're trying to teach. And so I was always pounding, here's what we're teaching, here's what we're teaching, here's what we're teaching, and that's not expressing this well enough, let's go do it again, let's go do it again. But then finally, when we had this outline done together, I then thought, wow, you know, I'm here with this really great writer, he's a famous award-winning writer. I thought that I'd held my own and even kind of pushed for things that I thought were, I played my part of this partnership well. The outline seemed balanced in the sense of how much we had to contribute to it. And then he said, okay, well now it's my job to go and write the final prose, so you know, leave me alone for a month and I'll bring you the chapters. And he started sending me chapters. And from the very first chapter, as I began to read it, the first thing I noticed was, I don't recognize this at all. But then I did. I mean, he started with a setup that we had never discussed. But it set the stage so masterfully, and then fell into the parts that I had worked on with him, you know, to make sure that those lessons were really in there. But the prose I was reading was so much more powerful than anything we'd ever debated before. You know, I went, okay, I am not the writer, you are the writer. But it really was important that I was there to play that part on the lessons. So that was one interesting part of a writing, you know, partnership. The second one, we sort of talked about at the very beginning, which was my work with David Fisher, who's my co-author in this case. And by the way, he also ghostwrites. So there's a number of TV personalities who write books about history that they didn't write. That instead, in fact, they didn't even partner with David. David just wrote them, and these guys, you know, get the credit for it, which I find a fascinating fact that happens in life so thoroughly. But depending on how we're doing on time,
We're fine.
okay, then I might like to share with you some of these stories that if you read the book, you'll also see these in the book, but once you hear me say it, you'll notice the differences between how I say it. This goes back to that thing we were discussing earlier, which is that as an orator, these are, you know, as I travel, I love collecting stories, and Kent knows that I love telling these stories, and I think I've collected some fun stories, like going to space is a pretty cool story, right? That doesn't get old. That does not get old. And it's fun to retell. But there's others that represent an interesting challenge. When we were writing this book together, there's one story, it has to do with Austin, so I'll tell this story here first, and if we have time and interest, I'll tell a few of these others. And then it's interesting to see what we did with them in the book. And the first story I'll describe as the second one on that list is the Uzi story. Do you know the story? Kent, have I told you this story?
I don't know.
Okay, so we'll see if you have. So, how many of you remember about 20 years ago, a comet by the name of Shoemaker-Levy crashed into Jupiter? Do you remember that?
Yeah.
Okay, I remember that this existed. Well, that is the night this story happened. And the reason why that night is when this happened is Kent knows my home in Austin up on City Park Road has an observatory on top of it. And in fact, the observatory was almost never used. But this day would be a great day to invite friends over to look through the observatory, because right after sunset, the black impacts of the pieces of this comet as it broke up would be visible through even a modest telescope. And I had a modest telescope on top of my house, so I invited over all my friends to come and watch these black spots, and we did. And it was cool to see, but by 9 p.m., all of these have rotated a view on Jupiter. Everybody goes home, and by 10 or 11 o'clock, I go to bed. However, because I had friends over, I had turned off the lights on my house that normally illuminate my dome, so my house looks a little different. And I had locked the front gates to my property open for friends coming in and out, and I had never closed them. And about midnight, somebody rings my doorbell. And I'm going, oh, it's probably some friend who's come late, doesn't realize it's actually over, and I'm in my underwear in bed. The front doors of my house are glass. I don't really want to go downstairs to tell somebody to go away. So, but I'm thinking like, well, at least I don't know who it is. So I go to a window and I can see there's a guy standing out front of my house that I don't recognize. They're wearing a baseball cap, a Rolling Stones t-shirt, jeans, tennis shoes, I don't know. So I go like, well, I'm gonna keep an eye on them until they leave. And they don't leave. They basically hang out for 5, 10, 15 minutes. Then they begin to sort of walk around one side of my house a little bit, walk around the other side of my house. So I'm like on the upstairs of my house, walking along to look out windows at them, kind of wishing they would get tired and leave my house. And I'm thinking like, wow, how can I get this person to leave? And I thought, oh, I can close the gates from my phone. And I don't have a fence around the whole place. I just have gates on the driveway to keep cars out. But I figured if I close the gates, they'll get the idea they're on the wrong side of this security barrier, and maybe they'll go wait in the street, or whatever it is. I'm not even sure exactly what I thought would happen, but I closed the gates. They noticed the gates closed, and sure enough, they go around the edge of the gates. They disappear into the street in the darkness. I watch for another 10 minutes. Nobody seems to come back to my property. Go back to bed. 3 o'clock in the morning, crash of breaking glass. And it's in my pool area that's right outside my master bedroom. And so at this point, I immediately think somebody has been casing my house for 3 hours, thinks nobody's home, and is breaking in. So I go to this window, and sure enough, there's that same guy having just thrown a rock through this window, and I'm going like, okay, if I just make some noise, he will run off. So I take my arm, and I go to bang on this window, and I put my arm right through double pane glass. No injuries, oddly. But I smash out this whole window down into my pool, but now I can talk to him. and so I say, get the F out of my house. And he looks up right at me and then continues into my house. And I'm going, oh, this is not good. And so I live alone, and I'm out up City Park Road, if you know where that is. It's kind of a little bit out in the countryside, sort of. But first thing I do is call the police, and 911, and the police said it'd be 15 minutes before they get there.
Wow.
And so I'm going like, shit, that's a long time for this guy who is in my house, knows I'm in the house, continue to my house. And so and my house, by the way, is filled with armor and swords and crossbows and stuff. So literally every wall has a crossbow hanging on it, and suits of armor in almost every corner. And I also own some guns. But I have never owned guns for home protection. That never crossed my mind. But I was smart enough to put them all in a safe. So there were no guns hanging anywhere on the walls, and I had a gun safe. But the gun safe is only filled with exotic guns, like this thing called a street sweeper, which is like holds shotgun shells, but like a Tommy gun with shotgun shells. And they're kind of all just weird guns. To me, in my mind, they go along with the swords and the armor. They're just part of the same continuum. But I don't even know if I have any ammunition. And so I'm scrambling to go, do I have a gun that I also have ammunition for? And the first match that I find is the Uzi. That's why this is the Uzi story. So I load a 9mm Uzi.
Oh my God.
And I have the police in one ear, and I have my gun like this, and I go to the master bedroom door, and I crack it open, and I'm looking at the top of the staircase from where I am. And I'm talking to the police here, and I'm going, what do I do? And I can hear the guy in my house walking around on broken glass, and he's talking either on a phone or talking to somebody else, so I actually don't know what he's up to, but he's talking to somebody now. And so now I'm worried there might actually be multiple people in my house. And so I describe all this to the police. And by the way, I also have like the back doors of my bedroom are glass also on another deck, so there's ways for people to come in from any side. So I go to the police, I go, what do I do? What are my rights? There's somebody in my house who can hear me talking to you, the police, and they are not believing. What do I do? And they say, Mr. Garriott, this man's in your house and you feel threatened, you shoot him. It's like, okay. So I'm standing here, 5 minutes goes by. I eventually decide, I ought to be in a more central spot to see what else is happening in my house. So I leave the bedroom and I go to the top of the stairs where I can now see more parts of the house. I can still hear him downstairs chomping around. And then he walks into view at the bottom of the stairs. He turns the corner, starts walking up the stairs directly at me, and about the distance from me to you, he looks up at me, and I say, "Stop or I'll shoot." And he stops. And now the police ask you, "What's going on, Mr. Garrett?" I give a description. This person is not wearing a hat, has on no shoes, and no shirt. So I don't know if it's the same guy or not. And so I explain that to the police, and they say it's going to be 10 minutes before they get there.
Oh, no.
Ah,
Oh, my God.
So we stand here face to face for about 5 minutes.
Oh, my.
ah,
At the end of 5 minutes, he kind of shrugs his shoulders and decides he wants to continue walking around my house. What do you do? What do you do? Do you shoot him or not?
He's just walking around.
It's hard to say. It's hard to say what's going to happen. He's moving. He's no longer staying still.
has he been talking to you at all?
No, it has been
Not a
perfect
word has been
silence.
spoken.
Perfect silence. We've been staring at each other for 5 minutes.
Wow.
He decided he's done with that.
And were you
Or is-
calm?
No, by no means was I calm.
You're standing there, I mean, well, okay.
Or is
Well, but
it,
about every 60 seconds, I'm getting asked by the police what's happening again, and I see us saying we're standing here facing each other. That's all that's really happening is 1 minute updates to the police and countdowns till the police
Did
arrive.
he have a gun or anything? Did you feel?
No, but by the way, you don't have time to think about this stuff.
Yeah.
You have a fraction of a second. Do you shoot or not?
is this movement
Shoot
toward
him
you
in the
or away
leg.
from you?
Okay, you shoot him in the leg. What would you do?
Only if he was moving toward me, I would shoot.
Yeah.
So it depends on exactly. You're going to pause long enough to know which way you think he's moving. You hope.
Yeah, I, if he's coming towards me. That's what
Okay,
I'm
well-
thinking. I'm not in the
So,
position, but
by the way, I have no idea what really went through my head. And it literally is happening. That moment
A
is
second.
fast,
Yeah.
fast moment. What I would like to believe went through my head was like, I don't really want to kill anybody. But it's also important to know that I'm willing to fire this gun. And so I actually aimed just a few inches away from his head and pulled the trigger. And so I put a hole through my house. But this also makes the police a little concerned. Because they're now screaming like, what happened, what happened, what happened? Because the gun was just fired.
Right.
Also, by the way, this guy doesn't even notice.
no way.
He doesn't
Oh.
notice. He does turn around and he starts walking back down the stairs. Goes back into the broken glass and starts walking around the rest of my house again.
Oh my God.
But now the police are completely freaked out, and so it has clearly escalated my relationship with the police at this stage. But 5 more minutes goes by with him now just nothing. He doesn't come back into my view. Police shows up, 2 cars, 4 officers, guns out. They come to the front door, which is locked. And so I then have to go down. I'm gonna plug my bathroom. So I go down to my bathroom with my Uzi, unlock and open the front door, and let the police in. Police fan out my house. They find one guy. He had taken off his clothes, folded them very neatly in my guest bedroom. I was sitting on the edge there. They throw him on his face, handcuff him behind his back. They tell me to guard him, and if he moves, you shoot him. If he moves, you shoot him. And I actually think at that point, if he had moved, I would have shot him, and I would have regretted it, but I didn't. He did not move at that point. The police sit him up after this, after they determined no one else was in my house. And by the way, I live out in the country, there's no car anywhere nearby either, so he walked somehow out from downtown to get here. And they asked him, who are you, and why are you here? And his name is Daniel Dukes, and he's played my games. And he believed he saw a hologram of Lord British over my house, beckoning to him to come receive his reward for completing his quests. He then thought I had trapped him inside the house, and he was really trying to get out. And so we're going, okay, this is a young man, he's clearly disturbed. They take him off to jail. But 2 things happened at that point. And so that might be the end of part 1 of the Uzi story, but oddly it continues. When they put him in jail, first of all, every time he goes in and out of jail, which happens fairly commonly, I get a phone call from the police telling me, hey, by the way, he's not in jail, he might come visit, so beware. Or, hey, he's back in jail, he's not going to be coming to visit, so don't worry. But they also call his parents, because he's maybe 19, 20 years old, this young guy. And his parents go, look, our son is schizophrenic, we've tried to help him, there's really nothing we can do, he's your problem. And so the parents do nothing to help. Well, after about a year, the police quit calling. He's gone off radar. And about 3 years later, or maybe 1 or 2 years later, maybe a little less, one of my employees read something in the newspaper that brings to my attention, which is Daniel Dukes has, in this intervening year or so, found his way from Texas to Florida, where he jumped in the killer whale tank of a killer whale named Tilikum that had killed one trainer already, then killed Daniel Duke, then later killed another trainer, and just this last year, that was made into a documentary called Blackfish, about this killer whale that was the original Shamu that killed 3 people, including the guy that broke into my house. And you might think that was the end of the story, except then his parents sued SeaWorld for wrongful death. To which then I called SeaWorld and explained that those parents that person had an interesting incident in my house, and those parents were involved in it in an interesting way. They took depositions from all folks down here, and that case was dropped. Anyway, so that is the easy story. So,
Gee,
That's my story.
but
that's amazing story. Whoa.
The answer is no, I had not heard that story. Wow.
But just to wrap up, but just to tell you, the point is that is a story that I like retelling. I tell it about the same way. The part I like about telling it is asking you, what would you do? Because that was a profound moment for me to go like, I'm really glad I didn't shoot him, but I could imagine it could have gone very differently, even for me. I mean, I believe, I know I wouldn't want to actually shoot anybody, but these things are happening in real time under incredible levels of stress.
Yeah.
And so it makes you very forgiving of people in some similar circumstances that do things that you might think were stupid ideas. And
because in that moment,
it is.
amygdala is fully on fire
Totally.
and closes down your prefrontal cortex.
Totally.
So your ability to problem solve and to make a decision, it's...
And similarly, when they told me if he
Yeah.
moved, shoot him, if he had moved, and by the way, this guy's schizophrenic, he could have moved, right? He could have just flinched.
Yeah.
There was a higher probability I would have shot him right there lying on the ground handcuffed than there was when he was standing on the stairs out in front of me.
And you'd be
And-
given extra permission, and that's.
And I was given a command.
Yeah.
I was told by the police, also with guns, to shoot him, and I would have done it. And so anyway, it's just fascinating.
Question, so that story, do you use it now in your games?
I don't, and that brings up another,
You learn from it? Because what's interesting is you put people in that position in your game.
not explicitly. So here's what I do. Just like my game with the false prophet is veiled in a way that I don't think people would recognize it. Like another story that's not one of these, but I love, that was meaningful, is I was in Antarctica hunting for meteorites, as one does. And in Antarctica, the winds all flow from the South Pole outward. So hot air rises over the equator, goes to the pole, comes down to the pole, and then goes northward from the South Pole. And the point of that is that winds going over mountain ranges tend to create these turbulence on the north side of mountain ranges. And the ice in Antarctica is about 2 miles thick, but this constant wind over thousands and thousands and thousands of years digs out these bowls on the long run of these mountains. Then when you walk in these dishes, these bowls, looks like a frozen tidal wave about to fall, crash onto you. You might imagine seeing like frozen woolly mammoths or things in. I mean, it's incredibly surreal. It seems like you're walking in a Tim Burton movie. For me, it was a really profound experience. But if you try to do that in a game and you just build a 3D model of a tidal wave thing, it just wouldn't come out. I mean, it wouldn't translate. And so what I capture and what I try to express in this book is that I collect these little vignettes of inspiration. And I never know, and what I'm trying to do in my games is create similar moments of feeling. But it's almost never with the same circumstance. It's always something very tangential. So I'm looking for ways to create moments of profound epiphany. You know,
Here's one
in a
of the
sense.
images I have a friend who just got back last week.
Yeah,
Look at that.
yeah.
What's this?
Yeah, until space, Antarctica is by far the most amazing place I've ever been on the planet.
Okay, we're at a transition point, but I want to manage the transition, and we'll discuss this in just. But I want to say one other thing. By total coincidence, yesterday I was going through the Georgetown Police Department's new training facility, and I took their confidence course, and one of the things we did was we went into the holodeck. They didn't call it that, but that's what it seemed like to me. And we've got, an automatic revolver and with the laser shoots and our choice of scenarios. And so we choose a scenario, and then we have to decide, are we going to shoot that particular perpetrator or not? And it was all totally phony, and we all knew it was phony. We knew we were safe, and yet we all experienced fear, anxiety, all of those things. And the teaching point for the young officers is imagine how they feel when it's real. They know that if a bullet hits them, they die. Whereas we're just, how can I get him before he gets me? The difference between real life and a video game. And that was the point they were trying to teach us. It's a program called Leadership Georgetown. Was give the cops, when you read that they shot for the mass, the rectangle mass, instead of trying to knock the gun out of their hand, think about what they're going through. Think about how hard that is. And they require the police to have 2 sleep cycles before they write up the incident because of what happens in the brain. Okay, immediately following something like that. So it's all just incredibly interesting, and it's amazing how our experiences all overlap in so many ways. Now, what we would normally do at this point, it's just after 11, what we would normally do is stop the guests, thank them a whole bunch, and start reading each other's work. But we are all going to be around next month and next month and next month, and this may be the only chance we have to hear stories. So unless there's an objection,
Oh, no.
I think we ought to just hear some more stories.
Yes. Yes.
All right.
Yes.
So just
Is that in the book?
let's visit and share.
In
Tell us
fact, I
stuff.
forgot to tell you about how one of the arguments that I had with David Fisher, that ultimately went my way, but we had a difference in how to express the story. Because when that literally is my favorite story to retell because of those little moments of challenge to the listener. But when we put it in the book, one of the things that David wanted to do was put it in the book twice. Once in sort of a Reader's Digest, less passionately told way, and then one was more in the way that I do it as an orator. And I actually felt that by having in there either side by side or opposite pages or even one following the other, sort of destroyed my favorite story because you're now being too analytical at a moment that I was really wanting you to have an emotional response to the story. And so eventually it just showed up pretty much as I just described it to you. But it was an interesting moment of real back and forth we had. It was probably our longest back and forth was how to deal with that story in this book.
Well, what I like about it too is people are able to judge what police officers, other people do in that situation, and I don't know what I would do in that situation. We can think it through, although when you're in that.
Yeah, and again, even my own analysis is obviously takes much longer than I had to make the decision.
I find the story especially fast, well, it was incredibly fascinating all the way around. But one of the things that got me was a lot of people, they get into games and all this other stuff, and there's an argument that, they lose touch with reality, okay? So reality becomes like the kid, for an example, that was there.
Right.
And you didn't lose your reality because you do these games, you've got all these weapons and everything, but when you're faced with the actual human, contact, it's totally.
It changes the
Well, it changes, but I mean, some people wouldn't be able to change because they get in
Right.
that world and they get lost. I've seen
Right.
that before. with
Well,
something.
on a related story, so it's interesting, somebody asked me a little bit ago, like, how many people kind of get that they
Right.
get this deeper part of my stories, and as I mentioned, I think everybody gets it, in the sense of, you can't play these games without facing the meaning that is in them. That's the only way to get through it. And so for the players who appreciate my work, they interestingly, simultaneously, both appreciate it for not only the art, but also the philosophical part that is, while created for a fictional purpose, is actually pretty darn good, philosophy, or very carefully crafted philosophy at the very least. And yet they also are very careful to, when they talk to me about it, express that they understand that it's not the truth. You know what I mean? And a great case that I came up with one time, a young couple came to me and they had truth, love, and courage inscribed on their wedding bands. And they'd actually met through my games. Both really liked the philosophy. But the way they brought it up to me was to very carefully go, by the way, we're not crazy. We really do separate, we know what you wrote was driven by fiction, but we really appreciated it. And it brought us together. And so we've had that inscribed on the inside of our wedding bands. But it's fascinating how many people couch it when they're very careful to express. They separate, truth from the game's intent.
Well, Red Skelton, the great comedian,
Oh, yeah.
phenomenal comedian, but one time they said, oh, the television or whatever doesn't affect people. He says, do you think they would spend billions of dollars in advertising if it didn't affect people?
Right,
So
yeah, yeah.
it was, that I still remember that line because it was so, because I watch people, occasionally, and, that they go outside of reality. They
Yeah.
live in their own little world completely, and it's scary. Like you said, that kid was, you didn't, you were right there.
Yeah.
And had to have a,
Yeah.
So you gave me a great idea. I'm working on a keynote speech right now, and the expansion of that is part of my book. And the working title right now is Living Beyond Your Limits. So my last leg of climbing Kilimanjaro, I got blind, completely blind, couldn't see a thing after there were worse snow and ice in 20 years.
Like snowblind, so you.
Well, we don't think it was snow
No,
and
right,
ice because
so
we were
oxygen?
summiting at night. Pressure on my eyeballs, that's what my optometrist is thinking. We don't know, but I got blind. And in that moment, and I'm seeing myself as I was rehearsing this week, at that moment when we realized my guide had fixed the light on my forehead and said, you should be able to see now. And I'm like, I can't see a thing. And so I'm panicking and I'm crying because my fingers are freezing and they're burning. And in that moment, I'm saying to myself, this is part of my speech, what do I do, what do I do? But when I heard you say, you wanted to hear what the audience is thinking, great opportunity to turn to the audience
Right.
and say, what
Do
would
you
do?
turn back now or
Yeah,
not?
what do you do? Because a lot of people say to me, were you crazy? You continued to the summit after you got blind? And for a moment in my mind, I remember that I read that on rare occasions, mountain climbers go blind temporarily. And I found so much solace in the word temporary. I couldn't
Right.
remember if it was hours, days. I just remembered temporary.
Temporarily.
And that one word
That was enough.
made me see the summit in my mind's eye. Somebody
Yeah.
used that and
I like
tried
it. That's
to
great.
engage the audience with
I
that.
like it.
So maybe bring back from the summit though.
No, it came back about 95% by the next morning. Yeah.
When you were down.
Yeah, my depth perception was off for a while, but I could see people and I could, yeah.
Freezing
Phenomenal
on, that's just where the
experience.
Jamaican wants to be.
I know, I put that in, I'm a Jamaican, what am I doing?
Did you try to do this while you were up the summit?
What is that?
Make a pop noise with the.
I did not.
So I've never been to the top of Kilimanjaro or any higher mountains, but for my training for space flight, they put me in a. Not the one in the space station.
Close enough.
But they did put me in a hypobaric chamber
Okay.
and drew it down to 9,000 meters in altitude, which is Everest. And but we had oxygen. But one of the things I noticed is I just happened to go, all right, I wanted to make that pop sound, and you can't.
Can't make it.
You cannot create enough pressure differential between a full vacuum in your mouth to make a pop sound. And I was like shocked. I mean, I just did it on accident. Nobody told me to do it. I can't remember why I just happened to think of doing it. I was like, oh my gosh, you can't. And then I actually struggled to try to create a vacuum pressure change. So anyway, I'm curious now to talk to somebody who's been to a high mountain just to see.
Yeah, and I'm doing Machu Picchu
So could
in
you do-
July, so I'll see.
Did you do that in the chamber? No?
Machu Picchu.
So you just kind of-
Yeah, then, yes.
Yeah, no, nothing. There was no pressure differential between as hard a vacuum as you could create and what you were sitting in.
when you go to, when I went to Tibet years ago, I still remember getting off the plane in Tibet, and it's 12,000 feet. And if you take your hand and go like this, you can feel the air. And at that level, you go like this, you don't feel it.
Yeah.
It's really fascinating.
Yeah.
And we went up to 18,000 golf balls. So I know the experience is amazing when different things happen.
Sorry, Richard, I
Yeah,
have to
please.
run. so
No, of course,
Thank
pleasure.
you.
Of course, absolutely.
Bye, everybody.
you.
See some of you.
Well, now that she's gone, I can tell space stories.
So I was going to ask you, feel free to defer if this is too personal a question, but as someone who is always seeking, I'm interested if you wouldn't mind sharing, some of where your search has led you on your real life philosophy.
Yeah, so let me frame with, I am not a religious person. I would probably be best described as an atheist. However, I find religious practice to have great meaning in huge swaths of it. And so I really enjoy reading religious texts, if I can say the word, and borrowing from it. And I find and what I mean by lots of areas, like for example, I think that all the rituals of, say, celebrations of coming of age, I think are actually really important. I think that community coming together at various times is actually really important. You know, even that little subtle things like, you know, in the middle of the winter, it's really good to have reasons to have brightly colored celebrations in what otherwise could be a long, dark winter. You know, there's all these rhythms that have come out of it, and often that are similar between various doctrines that I think have real meaning and real importance. So I borrow from them liberally. A lot of even what I put in my games has come directly or indirectly from parts and pieces, although exactly which ones I stole from when I would be hard to know. And while and by the way, you know, when I came up with Truth, Love, and Courage, not only did it literally, you know, it really did seem right when I looked at it. You're gonna find this to be the weirdest rhythm of what made me more comfortable with it. Is I noticed after I came up with it, I realized other writers of fiction for other purposes seem to have come up with the same rhythm. For example, The Wizard of Oz. You think about the Scarecrow is truth, the Cowardly Lion is courage, and the Tin Man is love, and how and why L. Frank Baum came up with that set of three, I have no idea. But if you look around in fiction, you'll find that same rhythm comes up a lot. And so, well, by no means do I think that it's truthiness in capital T, truthiness, or truth. But I actually think it's, you know, it's pretty defensible. You know, it's not bad. It definitely will motivate people to do good things and motivate people to avoid bad things. Yeah. And so I've never really espoused it as a belief system, but it's as close as I actually have. Well, in fact, here's a, you know, I have these unsolved problems like this one that I continue to work on. Let me just grab another one. So when I finished the Ultima series, I then said, okay, well, if I start a new game and I want to include a moral philosophy in it, if I have to compete with what I just made and ran for 20 years, it's going to be really hard. And coming up with another arbitrary fiction that competes with that first one, I didn't think I could do it, right? I didn't think I was going to do a better job of it. That one stood the test of time pretty well. So I said, if I'm going to do anything different than that first one, I have to do something that's actually even closer to what I really believe. And so I've actually put a layer on top of it in my most recent games, which is more closely to what I really believe. And I'm going to take you on that journey as to, the best way to describe it is just to show you how I came up with it. I sat down and I said, well, you know, these ethics and virtues that I put in the game are great, but how, you know, is there a reason you must believe them? And I go, no, there really isn't. But why is it good to believe them? I was thinking about why are these things might be good to believe? And I used a little anecdote, and I said, you know, let's suppose you live on a desert island by yourself. Here we are living on a desert island, and it's a desert planet. You know, you're the little prince living on asteroid B612 or whatever it might be. You know, if you were the only person in existence, and there were other inanimate objects around, like a river that you could get fresh water out of to drink, or you could poison it, and you're literally the only one that will be affected by that, well, then in my mind, there's no moral reason that you shouldn't poison the river. It's stupid, but I don't think you should feel obligated not to, if you know what I mean. Right. And the same thing's true, you know, with the trees and other things, and the resources. You can split all the resources if you wish, because you're not sharing them with anybody. And so I would describe this state of being alone in the universe. The only thing that should, and by the way, as you can tell by a lot of my things, I like pushing buttons and using symbols and things that I know cause an initial backlash. But I actually call this state hedonism, meaning do whatever it is you want, because there's really no reason not to, okay, if you're by yourself. However, we don't live alone. We actually live amongst other people, and that is to some degree because you're born into a group, a social group, and you have parents when you arrive, etc. But we actually do benefit from that, right? You could go live as a hermit on a desert island if that was really what you thought. But I think you will increase your own personal happiness and success in any way you want to measure it by living amongst other people. And as soon as you live amongst other people, you can't do all those things that were just this word hedonism anymore. You now have to have a set of ethics that is not, in my mind, a correct set of ethics. I mean, if you go read, you know, Plato writing about utopian societies, I mean, he was really trying to do his best based on his worldview at that moment to come up with a utopian ideal, but it included all kinds of really horrible, you know, things that we would not accept in the modern sense. And so in my mind, a good ethic is sort of a negotiated outcome, you know, meaning if I don't want you to poison the water, I need to also be willing not to poison the water. And so sharing, you know, those resources is not a truth capital T, but it's a good ethic. And so I eventually came up with this symbol. I have lots of symbols in my games. This symbol is yourself, meaning you want to make yourself happy, and if you're not at least trying to be happy, you'll succeed at not being happy. That would be sad for you. But you also have to balance the fact that you live in a limitless society of other people. And so this sort of ethical hedonism, purposely written in a way to be, confrontational, is my philosophy of life. And I actually have that tattooed on my leg. And so, but this is in my newest games. This is sort of the way of every game I expanded a little bit. This is the latest expansion. This really is what I believe. That the purpose of life is to be happy. That if you're not pursuing happiness, too bad for you. You'll succeed at not being happy. But you can't be just hedonistic. You really do have to have a set of ethics, and those ethics have to be an agreement that we all have concurred on together, even though there's some fundamental logic to what drives most of them.
Yeah, thank you.
Sorry?
You said there was a dilemma.
No. It's really the balance. Sorry, the dilemma is.
No, but you said there was something you were fighting about.
No, I just mean these kind of unfinished projects. And so what I haven't really done is fully concluded, how to roll my truth, love, and courage up underneath these precisely. But it's still a work in progress.
Yeah, thank you.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, of course.
On the hedonism, I guess I'm a little, however you thought we were created, whether it's through a superior being, God, or, through nature and everything else, we have this gift that we have all these things. If you lived on an island and you did complete hedonism, are you not going against that creation as well? So can you ever really justify hedonism, I guess is the question.
I have the same question. You say it doesn't matter, but what
See,
about the river?
See what happened there?
The river is important. What about the trees? They are important in their own way.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, but again, in my actual personal worldview,
He's sharing his world.
I'm fundamentally an atheist.
Right.
I am a spiritual atheist. So one of the atheists. So here's what I'm gonna
Spiritual atheist.
watch the following.
Do you
So-
believe when you die, that's the end of you?
That's the end.
That's the end, okay.
Absolutely.
So that's your definition of atheist?
Correct.
Okay.
I do not believe. I am non-theistic. I do not believe in a supreme being.
Okay.
But here's why I would still describe spirituality as part of my worldview. But it's a unique, just like I use the word hedonism purposely tongue-in-cheek and a little bit to cause confrontation. Spirituality I use, again, a little uniquely. But here's like these symbols I put in my game. So let's suppose this is the concept of truth. This is the concept of love. This is the concept of courage. And I mentioned, some of you may have heard that when I came up with these as the principles that I worked on, 3 didn't give me enough plot activity. So I actually needed more than just 3 names off my board of things that drive people good and evil. And so I used the iterations of these 3. And so I basically said, truth alone is, I called that honesty. So I made 8 virtues out of 3 principles. Truth alone was honesty. Love alone was compassion. Courage alone was valor. Truth tempered by love was justice, where I said you don't cut off the hands of the little kid who steals some bread. You are also loving with your interpretation, so that became justice. Love and courage I called sacrifice, meaning your love for your own child is obviously important, and that love is what will drive you to be willing to jump on the railroad tracks to save your kid. And so that also requires courage to be able to face the line or whatever it is. So love and courage became sacrifice in the sense of self-sacrifice. Courage and truth became chivalric honor. Then one that touched all 3 of these I called spirituality, which we'll come back to in a minute. And then I drew a circle around all of this, which touches none of them, which would be humility, except because it touched none of them, I instead inverted it. I used pride, but since pride is not a virtue, in my game, the city that would have otherwise been humility was called Magencia, but it was destroyed because it was a pride city, and the only survivors of the destruction were the humble shepherds. Okay, so the game used these symbols for all of its kind of rhythm, and this gave it, and after a while you go like, oh shoot, I remember them all, but I don't remember what these 2 is, but since you sort of get the rhythm, you can kind of look at the symbols and go like, oh, I'm missing one piece, because I figured out what all the other line segments are, but what's that one? And so all the clues in the game that are text combined with the symbols in the game all give you hints to this rhythm of the world. But now to go back to spirituality, what I mean by that in the game, and also in my, again, I wrote this for a game. I did not really write this for my personal philosophy, but I obviously thought about it a lot. And so there's some overlap. In this case, what I mean by spirituality is care and crafting for my place within the universe. I mean, am I ultimately a force for good? Am I ultimately or not? Do I care about leaving the world a better place than when I arrived? And so that's the way I use that word.
So as I hear you share, that does not resonate with me as confrontational. It resonates as being provocative.
Right. That's probably a better way to put it. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
And authentic.
Yeah.
When I see ethical hedonism, what I hear you saying is, do what's in your heart, do what lights you up. Be
Right.
ethical about it if you're going
Right.
to do it. Versus, I grew up in a world with lots of indoctrination on religion, on politics. And it took me late into my 40s to realize, I don't actually believe that. I'm going to go figure out what I believe and what's in my heart. And then all that stuff started to just unravel, and the truth of who I was, the hedonistic, which I think my parents would say, that's hedonistic. Why are you doing that and not being in church on Sunday?
Right.
That's what I hear you say.
Yeah, and yes, when I use the word hedonism, what I really mean is pursue happiness.
Yes.
That's really what I mean, and I say it in a provocative way on purpose, and it's meant to be a little oxymoronic, in the way that it sounds.
Like spiritual atheism.
But, right.
The same
It's
thing.
exactly.
Great term. So if I say it back to you, am I hearing correct, kind of like a global viewpoint where one life paradigm might say, consider others better than yourself. One might say, consider yourself over others, that you're this ethical hedonism that is it's a global thinking. You're looking out for your own self-interest, at the same time looking out for
Yeah, I'm
the
saying
self-interest.
all I'm saying is if you're not at least trying to be happy, you will succeed in not being happy.
Sure, yeah.
And that would be a shame for you.
Yeah.
And while you are pursuing your happiness, the only fundamental limits you should put on that is ethics. And I think that, and in fact, the way I often describe it is this. I go, if you tell your child premarital sex is bad, there are a couple of reasons you can use, there's a couple of ways you can describe why. If you say premarital sex is bad because a deity is going to hate you and strike you down or make you suffer or whatever it is, it's something, a purely, there's a wide variety of religious approaches you can take to that. I do not call that an ethic. I split the words ethics and morals uniquely, and so I would call it a moral statement. If you say premarital sex is dangerous, you might get pregnant, you might get STDs, there's a variety of, you might regret it for some other psychological reasons, you're not taking care of yourself necessarily, there's a variety of these, that to me, that's a rational ethic. If it's rational, if you're using rationality, that's what I use as the definition of ethics. And if it's otherwise attributable to, again, deities that I don't believe in, then it's immoral. And I still might agree with the outcome, but I don't agree with your rationale behind it. And by putting, and I would actually argue this, like another thing I personally believe fundamentally is that there are politicians who go up and say things like, an elected official or person in general cannot be moral unless they are religious. And I have a huge problem with that.
Yeah.
Because I sit back and go, wait a minute, if you say I shouldn't murder people, and the reason I shouldn't murder people is because God says it's bad, but if I confess, I'll get over it and I still get to go to heaven, then I think that's a much worse, that will dissuade you from killing people less often than if you go, I think killing people really is just a bad idea. It is ethically wrong. It is irrational for me to think that it is okay for me to kill somebody else, because then it has to be okay for them to kill me. And if I want to continue to live, I need to stand by the assumption that killing is wrong. And so I think rationally concluding your ethics versus your morals will lead to the outcome of better behavior compared to a doctrine.
And the doctrine being presented, I think they have undermine themselves because of how things are being demonstrated, because the morality among many of our professed Christian leaders just kind of dismisses the story about you've got to be a Christian moral person to lead.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah, and in fact, a lot of my games, so again, these provocative or controversial, I skipped past a number of slides, but one, this one, the story in this one, happening at this time during my creation process, is a lot of religious leaders in the United States were coming out against video games. They were coming out against me. And this is right after I'd done my first game about ethics. And so I literally I felt the poster child for the opposite of what they were saying. And yet they were condemning me. And so this is my game that is absolutely, positively against the people that were in society in America at that time. Television evangelists and other, in my mind, extremists who were often preaching morality or stating that they were moral, while as often as not being caught cheating on their wives and other things, as often as not, making themselves rich on, fake, stage healings and, all these sort of things that I thought that they were in fact evil,
Right.
in contrast to my honest attempts to provide a positive moral or ethical, depending on where you want to use, compass.
My family dealt with that personally, face-to-face in church. My husband developed cloud gaming capabilities for GameStop. He had his little company. GameStop was excited. They bought it from him, so he made a couple of pennies out of it. And we had folks, because you've attended the same church, where they came to us and asked, how
Why are
can
you doing
you
this?
guys as Christian live comfortably benefiting from something related to games? And they didn't know who they were talking to.
Well, by the way, I have another place this happened in my own life is my oldest brother, his wife is a fundamentalist, I would describe her as. She actually gave me, when I was a freshman in high school, the copy of The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings to read.
Yeah.
So she basically started me on my
Unintended consequence.
Yes, the unintended consequence was that as soon as I started writing games that included magic, we began to have this conversation where she'd go like, oh, it's okay to write about it. It's not okay to play act it. And I'm going, that's bullshit.
This is crazy.
And so she, and by the way, she eventually, my brother became my business partner, my younger sister worked for us in the shop, my mother was our art director doing all the layout of all the early work, and my mom and dad were investors in the company. So everyone in the family worked for me or with me, except my oldest brother Randy, who had already become a medical doctor, so he was not really available. But they also then disowned us. So I literally have had no contact with my older brother and sister-in-law because she thinks I'm the devil.
Oh my gosh.
And she literally thinks that what I'm doing is evil. And so, and it goes back to the same thing.
Yeah.
And so, but again, she's exactly the kind of person that I'm hoping in some way to upset with my profiteering. I don't really mean to upset her, but I am honestly making fun of her. You know what I mean? But then that goes back to this game that has the pentagram on the cover. So I knew full well when I put that on the cover that this was going to take the people who thought I was doing evil and convince them that I was doing evil. Okay.
Yes.
And so here's what this game does. So this game, it says, I'd already spent 4 or 5 games playing in my goody-goody two-shoes world of everybody just wants to get along, right? So I've been trotting that ground and trying to find new ways to make it interesting or to fool people. So this time I said, I'm gonna switch it up. I'm gonna have you, the avatar, be taken instead to a world run by the bad guys. So like, let's suppose you were born in Saudi Arabia, if we consider them bad for point of argument for this moment, to consider their government bad. Or for whatever reason, it's just different. You know what I mean? Whatever it is, it's not what you believe. They believe something completely different. It is often at odds with what you believe. What do you do then? Or another way to frame it is, what if you're born into Nazi Germany?
Right.
And you said, put this gun in your hand and shoot the people on the other side, or shoot the people who believe differently, or we'll shoot you. Well, what do you do? When do you stand your ground and say, well, I'm willing to die for it? That's a pretty big decision to say. And it's pretty likely you'll pick up that gun and shoot people because, by the way, they're also telling you why it's logical you should, right? You're being you're being indoctrinated to this all at the same time. So this game is about finding yourself in a place that is in fact evil. And the only way to get out of this world is to do things that are ritualistic, but I don't think are actually evil. Like I don't think literally drawing a pentagram on the ground and lighting some candles in the corner. I think that does nothing, right? Well, in fact, by the way, I did research. If you, the manuals for my games are written as if the world is real. It never talks about a computer game. It always talks about the place you're going to go live. And so since I wanted to talk about magic, I went and bought a whole library of supposedly real magic books. And if you ever go buy a bunch of magic books, which you haven't, I recommend it, it's fascinating, you realize what total bullcrap it is. It makes no sense whatsoever. I mean, it's not even internally self-consistent in any way, shape, or form. I mean, it is comically badly written. It is comical to think that anybody would actually believe that this could summon a demon or cast a spell. It's somebody just writing down bullcrap because it is bullcrap. It literally doesn't do anything, right? It's in my mind, bullcrap. But I actually found that, again, like I did with some of these other things, I can do a much better job creating, if I'm going to create a ritual, in fact, I put it over here in some of these others. Like, if you think of, the old classic Halloween, oops, I must have missed it the other way, magic thing of, eye of a newt and wing of a bat and cauldron boil and bubble. That doesn't really add up to anything, right? Those are all things that sound spooky, but they don't really add up to anything practical. Well, my magic systems would work. And what I mean by that is, if you need something to catch fire, it will have sulfurous ash in it. Any spell that you can imagine that would have flame associated with it, it will have sulfurous ash in it. And if something needs a projectile to go from me to you, it will always have a black pearl in it as the nexus of the projectile. And if it's going to be a binding, if it's going to bind you or an effect I want to stick to you, it has spider silk in it. And so all of my magic is internally self-consistent. And then similarly, if you look at the language, I used Latin root words that are consistently used. So like on nox, on means negate, nox means poison, and nox is a Latin root, noxious, right? So you can kind of, A for an like anti, so on nox, negate poison. And so again, I use them incredibly consistently. And that way, once you sort of learn the language of magic and you knew what ingredients you need to keep in your pouch of stuff you need to cast spells, you can figure it out, right? Even if I didn't tell you what a fireball was, it's something with flam in it. Phosflam, a big flame. Phosflam, a big fireball at you. And I'm gonna need a black pearl and need some sulfurous ash. That's it. So it's all logical. And so to go back to that one with the, I missed it, with the pentagram on the cover. If you want to do those, you literally sketch out a pentagram on the ground, you literally light candles in those four corners, and you stand in the center of it, and you yell these Latin root words and have the right reagents on you, and it happens. And so I actually put you through all the way through the ritualistic stuff that all your religious upbringing tells you that's going to literally summon a demon into the world, and guess what? It doesn't summon demons into the world. It's a game, and it works just fine. But I did it provocatively on purpose. And in fact, it was provocative enough. I actually had 3 employees quit over my inclusion. And that same game, Kmart and Walmart wouldn't carry it. First they put a sleeve on it like they do for Playboy magazines, and then later we produced a version without the pentagram on it just so they would have it on the store shelf. But again, I look at it and go like, that's the world we live in, where if it was on a book, it'd be just fine. Since it's on a game, it's not. We didn't do space stories yet.
I know.
Yeah.
Wow. Should we go over to space stories?
Yes.
You bet. Yeah, definitely.
Which I wish I took.
Yeah, 8 years of platinum in school, he says. That's where I put it to use in my gaming.
Yeah. But, well, let's talk about the complete non sequitur, but I'm going to talk about something called the overview effect. So, I think I mentioned at the beginning, my dad is also an astronaut. He went up on Skylab and the shuttle. And my dad is, his personality is Spock. And I mean the 1960s, Star Trek Spock. And And so my dad, to this day, my dad's still with us, but my dad, I have never heard the words "I love you" come out of my dad's mouth in his life. He has never held any family member, wife, or children to give them an embrace that I thought had emotion in it of any kind. Our language at home was always very logical and rational. By the way, my mom, by the way, made up for it in spades. So my mom was incredibly loving, engaged personality, but it's just interesting that my dad had this personality for this story. Because when I decided that I finally figured out how I was going to make myself into space, this was a bonding opportunity for me and my dad. Now, I was going to be the only one in the family, only person in history who's had this shared father-son experience of space. And so he immediately signed on to help me both arrange all my scientific activities, as well as be in mission control to run my schedule, because inevitably when you miss taking the picture of Tokyo out the window, it's going to be 3 days again before you pass over Tokyo, and so somebody has to rerun things for you to adjust all the strategies for where you need to be when. And people would often ask, what's the one piece of advice your dad gave you, or in what ways has your dad advised you? And my dad would always tell people when they ask him that, what advice do you give your son? My son's a smart boy, he didn't need any advice. He and his adults are just fine. The reality is, however, he gave me lots of advice, of course. But the key piece was something he did not describe emotionally, but in fact was emotional, which is he said, look, the one thing you're going to remember for the rest of your life is the view out the window. And so we need to plan you to be either with a camera taking pictures out the window, or at least be right next to the window with the opportunity to look out the window anytime it's daylight and you're passing over land, because that's the thing you're going to remember. And it turns out it was profoundly important. And here's sort of why. So if you, I'm going to borrow this coffee cup. When you are in orbit around the Earth, you're traveling at 17,210 miles an hour.
Wow.
So that means you go all the way around the Earth in 90 minutes. That means you see a sunrise or a sunset every 45 minutes. That means you cross entire continents like North America in maybe 20 minutes. And you're only 250 miles up. And 250 miles is like here to Houston, standing up. And the clouds are already a few miles up. And so space begins at only 50 miles or so, 62 and a half miles up. And so when you're 250 miles up, you actually are still intimately close. You actually you still feel close to the Earth. You can still see a great deal of detail. You can see roads and dams and obviously lakes and things of this nature. So you feel just intimately close. You can see the clouds, contrails of the airplanes, but you also immediately, and we're crossing the United States in say 20 minutes. 20 minutes is not instant. 20 minutes is actually a long time, but what you're seeing is like a fire hose of the reality in which we live, the truth about the reality in which we live, just pouring into your mind just by looking out the window. And it's profoundly better than, say, scrolling Google Earth by slowly. There's something about seeing it for real from this isolated outpost in space that makes you just glued to looking out the window. And so you begin to notice things. Like one thing you notice is how half the Earth is always covered in clouds. And so you notice a lot about how clouds form and move and interact with each other. And you see the fractal math in places over the Pacific where there's not much interference with temperature change or interaction with land masses. You see how erosion by wind, you see a lot of the deserts because they're not usually covered in clouds. And you see how the wind has sculpted these shapes in them that you can only see from space. There's things called great fans where the wind pours through a mountain range and then creates these ripples in the sand dunes that, if you were on the ground, you'd see dunes. You'd see little ripples in the sand, followed by bigger undulations, followed by bigger ridges. But you realize that rhythm continues all the way up to a scale that you could only interpret from space. And you see all the edges of the tectonic plates that you know about. You know how the fault lines are working, but you can see the damage done by the grinding of the plates, across all the seams in the plates of the Earth. And you can see how a forest fire will create enough pollution to fill not only the air above it, but frankly spread out over multiple states. And at that point you go like, wow, I can easily imagine how our cars and factories are putting out enough smog to easily fill a very thin amount of atmosphere. In fact, you look at the edge of the Earth and you can see how thin the atmosphere really is. That's all around the whole globe. And so you then begin to think about the impact of humanity. So you begin to notice that Every forest has roads in it and cities in it. Even the Amazon's full of roads. Even every desert, just like if you fly across the United States, we have crop circles, where we're pumping up fossil water from underneath to grow crops. Well, that's also in the Sahara and every place else on Earth. Humans are everywhere. Every river is dammed. Every mountain range has passes through it. Every desert is being pumped up, fossil water is being pumped out of. We're terraforming the Earth. The Palm Islands in Dubai, where we're pumping up sand and bringing whole new mountains and whole new islands into existence. And then you see things like that I hadn't, when I was a kid, not only my dad talk about clear cutting the Amazon, but there were television commercials when I was a kid. We'd talk about, oh, this is sad that we're clear cutting the Amazon. That I don't see those kind of commercials anymore, but it's still happening. I've been on the Amazon myself 20 years ago and saw it from the ground, but it's absolutely clear the scale of it happening from space. And then you also see it's happening all over Africa, which I had not heard anybody talk to me about previously. And so the point is you're paying a lot of attention to this, orbit after orbit after orbit. And then finally, after about 100 orbits, I flew over Austin, Texas for the first time. And suddenly went, oh look, there's Lake Travis. There's the dam, and there's the 360 bridge. There's my house. And then I could also see Houston and the Gulf Coast and these places that I've driven lots and I've hiked and biked lots. So I know the scale of Austin and Houston and Galveston and Dallas really well because we all live here. But then I'd also just been around the world 100 times paying really close attention. And suddenly you have this epiphany. You go, I now know the true scale of the Earth by direct observation.
Don't we need to send all of our leaders up there?
Absolutely, that's why. But you have this physical reaction. And the best way to describe it is, and by the way, I still get goosebumps. Even when I just start to describe this reaction, it still gives me goosebumps. But the best way to describe it is, in a scary movie where they might have an actor in a hallway and they'll dolly the camera back but zoom the lens in, where the actor stays the same size, but the hallway kind of, isn't this scary? Well, that's what happened. I'm looking out the window of the Earth doesn't change size, but your sense of scale collapses. And you absolutely go, you feel this deep, completely different than you had before connection to the Earth and the processes of it and the people on it and the scale of it, all just sort of disappears. And that has lasted, in fact, and that's called the overview effect. I'd never heard that word before my flight. I just got home and Googled it, said it can't just be me, let's Google it, oh yeah, overview effect. My dad obviously had it, but he's not capable of communicating that way. And my dad would never tell a story like I just told you, by the way. If you ask my dad about what it was like to go in space, he would say, it's nominal, a lot like training. Scuba diving is a close approximation. That would be that's my dad's total story about space. But,
He did tell me to look out the window.
But he did tell me to look out the window because he knew, he just didn't have the words.
It affected him, he couldn't tell the story.
First time I was fortunate to meet Buzz Aldrin several times, and he got up there and he was talking, and everybody's just, wow, meeting Buzz Aldrin. And a little girl goes, Mr. Aldrin, Mr. Aldrin. She says, what did it feel like to walk on the moon? Natural question. Well, little girl, men don't feel. And whether they did it or not, but you just feel everybody doing one of these.
Well, by the way, there's something like that. So just this last Saturday, I was in New York at the 115th anniversary of the Explorers Club. I'm on the board of the Explorers Club. That's how I built all these companies, is through connections that I met through the Explorers Club. And this is the 50th anniversary of Apollo. And so we had the majority of surviving Apollo astronauts, including Buzz, there with us. And the Discovery Channel was there to film it. And so actually, there's a Discovery special that's coming out that I'm going to be the host on this special. That'll include both one-on-one interviews and the panel discussions we had with all these guys. And because I'm the panel host, and so I can kind of change the rules, for the last question I invited my daughter up. And my son, but he's kind of too young. But they both came up wearing flight suits and with our mission patches on it, my dad's and my mission patches on it. And I had been coaching my daughter to ask one question, like, she's going to be potentially the third generation of space flyers, so that was what I was going to get her to talk about. But that's not what she asked. She got up on stage, and her first question is, why are there no girls on this panel?
Ooh.
Oh.
So,
right.
And that got that reaction from the audience, which was great.
Yes.
But then what was hilarious, and you won't see this because Discovery's going to cut out the first answer. The first guy, I think it was Al Warden, I think. Actually, maybe it wasn't. I don't want to make sure I don't throw the wrong person on the bus. But the first answer was, well, you know, we really had to get the very best people that were available for the job, and the people that were available at that time were, you know, us hardy men, basically. And the crowd was like, oh, you could hear the groan going in the crowd. And then Rusty Schweigert jumped in and he said, Kinga, let me tell you, the real reason is we were not nearly as smart then as we are now.
Oh, good answer.
So that's what you'll hear on the Discovery Program.
Good answer.
You won't hear the groaner.
I think we're gonna say something about the
Yeah.
I've read them
bathrooms.
several times.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
that is a fantastic place to officially stop with the overview effect.
Yep.
Thank you so much, Richard, for taking the time.
Fabulous.